Oh, giddy up. Day 21, 3 weeks in. And this week, I feel this different energy. So last week, it was a lot about the energy of communicating. And right now, I'm feeling very tactical. So today, let's talk about how to explain your complexity and the true value that you bring to the market with your unique solution for people who might not fully understand it without dumbing down what you do. And the reason I'm talking about this today is because as I continue to use this transmission series to excavate my own zone of brilliance and my own zone of genius, this has been coming up because it's a bit double-barreled for me, where I have an extremely vast set of skills. I do a lot of things. I can bring a lot of value to my clients in a very short amount of time by cutting through the noise and telling them exactly what I see and where the problems are. And also what's really interesting is I tend to attract clients who have a very sophisticated level of complexity with what they do. So they come to me because they have a complexity issue that they need to have simplified. And then I too am also a complex professional with many things that I do. And I too struggle with simplifying it. So we're coming at this from both sides. How to explain complex work to people who don't understand it without dumbing it down. So it all comes down to this. Here's the thesis of today's transmission. If your clients don't understand what you do, they can't buy from you. But if you oversimplify it to make it understandable, you end up losing credibility with the people who do understand it. Because again, there are different layers that you are transmitting your message to. So if you are speaking to the lowest common denominator and trying to pull them along with you, rather than speaking to the people who are ready to receive you, you're going to lose business on both ends of that spectrum. It's really a tightrope that a lot of professional service firms and consulting companies, technical product companies are walking every single day. And when I look and really analyze what I'm seeing, primarily on LinkedIn, but what's really interesting to me now is I'm leaning into YouTube. I mean, guys, I'm like 3 weeks into being like, I think I want to do YouTube. So I don't know anything about YouTube yet, but that is going to be my next thing to tackle. Is that I see folks either choosing one or the other. They go hyper specific for people who are already going to understand what they're doing, or they really dumb it down to the point where like, I don't fully understand what it is that they do. What do they do? So you're choosing one or the other. You're either staying technical or you're staying inaccessible, or you're simplifying or you're overly sophisticated, right? But here's what I have to tell you is that there is a third option. There is a third option, and it is truly the only reason that Story Studio Network exists today. And it is one of the key things that I do with my clients, because 20 years in this business, complex issues, like really complex things like policy, economics, technical innovation, legalities. I had to learn how to take the complex and make it accessible without eroding its truthiness or factual basis. And the skill is really what organizations with complexity, they actually need to develop that muscle and that skill. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how you might start to do that. So let's paint a picture. This is how I like to start, right? We're going to paint the picture here. So we're going to look at this technical approach. So let's say, for example, you are a consultant or a consulting firm. The work you do is incredibly sophisticated. It's multi-layered. You find yourself saying things like, well, it depends, is the answer to a lot of questions you get. Like, how do we go about doing this? Well, it depends, right? I work with so many clients, and that's the answer to the question. And that's an okay answer. It means what you do is incredibly complex. Story Studio Network, we do a thing where when a client asks for a specific work back with guarantees, we say we don't do that because everything we do depends. So what we do is we give them a dependent work back that we refer to as an if-then. If this happens, then this. If this, then this. It's a little bit like a professional version of a choose your own adventure, right? It's multi-layered and it requires deep expertise and decision-making ability that is nuanced and experienced. So your website, your content, your sales material kind of need to reflect not just that level of sophistication, but what's beneath it, which is your ability to function within that complexity with ease in a way that nobody else can. So they're technically accurate, what's on your website. They're detailed, they're comprehensive. But if that's all you're doing is just explaining the technicalities of all of these decisions, someone who doesn't understand that nuance is going to feel like it's incomprehensible. So if your website and your content is like all looking like an if-then statement, if this, if this, if this, it depends, nobody's going to understand you, right? You're going to lose deals because it looks like you're too smart for them to be in the room with you. Once you get the deal, that's when you can show them that level of complexity. But at the outset, if that's how you're positioning yourself, you're going to have a challenge, right? You're going to be overly sophisticated for that level of communication. The other side of it is your website, your sales decks, your social media, so on and so forth, is overly simplistic. So you strip all of that incredible knowledge and experience and your it depends and your decision making from your content, and you pivot to simplifying and using simple analogies and only doing digestible content and using ChatGPT to tell you what to say. And you create what I call tipsiness in your content, which is where all you do is explain. Here's a tip, here's a tip, here's a tip. You are tipsy. Tipsy falls over, usually on your face. You lose credibility with a sophisticated buyer who understands you and wants a little bit more of the it depends and the nuance, and they want to see how you make decisions, but they're not actually getting that because you're too scared to show that, because there are other people who won't understand that. So you see what I mean? It's a tightrope. Technical enough to maintain credibility, but accessible enough to be understood. That's what you need. That is the balance you're looking to strike. And most organizations are falling off one side or the other. Let me be clear. This isn't just a fun communications and marketing experiment to try to walk this tightrope. It's actually about ROI. It can be extremely expensive. You'll lose deals you should win because the buyer doesn't understand what you're doing with your approach and why it's different and why it might be worth more. This happened to me. Okay? This happened to me in the early days of Story Studio Network. We do not charge bargain basement prices because we are a complex, extremely experienced organization. I, for the very longest time, had a lot of trouble expressing that. And we lost deals because of it. People would come and expect to be paying $1,000 per episode. And when I'd say, no, we're actually 7 to 10 times more than that, it was completely lost on them because they had been attracted to my simple explanation of what we did. You'll notice if you do an audit of the way that I've been talking on particularly LinkedIn since about January of 2025, that I no longer entertain the dialogue of being in the podcastosphere, the pod sphere, as they call it. I don't entertain that conversation about how to get more downloads, how to grow the show, how to clip your show and repurpose it, and how to do all of these things to start your podcast. I stopped talking about all of that stuff because it was attracting the simplistic buyer who is totally worthy of being in the space. They just are not our client. They're not our client. We don't want a starter client. We're ready for the one who understands the nuance of narrative strategy, of communication strategy, of large scale brand association and storytelling. That's who we want. So I stopped talking about it altogether. And in fact, it led me to change my LinkedIn bio because about 3 months ago, Story Studio Network was the first. It was the lead role that I had as the CEO. I flipped it because when I thought about it, I was like, wait, in reality, what's most valuable is that I'm a communications consultant with a production company. I am not a production company that has a communications arm. I flipped that around because it's an indicator of the complexity of the buyer that I'm trying to attract. So I'm mirroring them so that I'm not attracting the wrong clients, right? Because that was really expensive for me. For about a year, I was attracting the completely wrong client. I was losing out because I was dumbing down my message. The other thing that will happen when you are speaking too simply about something that is complex, especially, is that you're going to extend your sales cycle way too long because you're going to get a lot of tire kickers. You're going to get a lot of people who need to do the work in order to say yes to you. And that is going to extend your sales cycle to an uncomfortably long period of time because you'll have to spend the first 3 meetings just explaining what you do to them before you can even get into a qualified sales conversation. For small business, that's like a nail in the coffin. It's not going to work, right? The other thing that it does is over time, it really erodes your thought leadership. This was the other reason that I started to pivot because there are a bunch of shops locally that are podcast production companies. They have spaces, they put people in front of microphones, they do fancy editing. Sometimes they steal my clients and they think that that's doing good business, but that's a whole other thing. And the truth is that I stopped talking like that because I actually don't see them as thought leaders. They're producers. They just produce, but they're not leading a conversation. And I want to lead a conversation because I know that's what's going to attract other people who want to lead conversations. And those are the people who I want to work with. Do you see what I'm saying? So all of this really comes down to, are you being overly technical with your abilities and balancing it with being accessible with what you're saying? And it's super, super hard to do. And I had to go through this. I was really close to my own work and I was like, wait, but I can't talk about this until I talk about this. I was too close to my own work, too deep in my own expertise. I said this off the top, like I lost the ability to remember what it was like to not know what I know. I was suffering from the curse of knowledge for too long. I was also, when I made this pivot, I was super worried about being misunderstood. That if I didn't come out and say, I run a production company and we talk about downloads and we do all of this editing and production and this and that and an interview, blah, 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 that people are going to misunderstand what I do. They weren't going to associate me with the output that I create because I was going to be too simple. And, I was really afraid. So for a long time, I rode that line of being like, no, I got to talk about podcast industry crap because technically we're in podcasting. But it was overly simplistic for what it is that I want to do. And it was shooting me in the foot, right? Here's another one that there was a good some amount of time where truthfully, I wasn't quite sure who it was I was trying to talk to. Am I trying to talk to the end client, like the listener of our shows, which was problematic because all of our shows have different listeners they're trying to get to. Who am I trying to talk to? Am I trying to talk to a technical person who wants to understand podcasting? Am I trying to speak to a communicator who wants to learn how to communicate better? Am I trying to speak to a CEO who wants to CEO better? I did this. You might be doing this, trying to speak to all three at once. That led me down a year-long pathway of wasting my time. Right? It's actually not a content problem. It's a narrative problem. And I'm being so open with you and telling you that even though this is what I do for people, I had trouble with this for the longest time. I didn't need more content. I actually needed to get really, really clear about what it is that I do and speak in a sophisticated and nuanced way, but use simple language. And that's now what I'm doing on LinkedIn, and it's working. And it's what I'm trying to do here on YouTube, and it's what I'm trying to do on the podcast. And based on the download numbers, which are growing leaps and bounds, I feel like it's working. So what you don't want to do, and you'll notice what I just said is, I got really clear about what it is that I do so I could speak about it in a nuanced way and use simple language. What I didn't do was simplify what I do. Being more accessible doesn't mean dumbing it down. It means speaking about something complex using simple terms. Using simple terms. Simplifying what you do to the point of taking away value is not going to clarify anything. Okay? So you actually need to think through what you do and then think about the language you're using to describe it. This is also why I see so many companies spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a content agency and then seeing no results. Because the agency doesn't actually understand your work deeply enough to explain it in a complex manner in order to simplify it without losing the value. They don't actually know how to thread that needle. So you're spending 6 figures on content that doesn't move the needle because they're dumbing down what it is that you do, trying to make hooks out of it that aren't actually aligned with the level of value that you bring. So I'm not going to go too much into the solution on a process level. If you want to talk about that, check my podcast from yesterday and the video from yesterday where I talk about how to think about your comms like a newsroom, because that's one of the ways to simplify this and to get over this hump of like, I'm working in a really complex situation and I need to figure out how to talk about it simply. But here's a couple other tips for you, is to find the human story. Every piece of complex work, no matter how technical, impacts people in real ways. That has to be the entry point to how you talk about it, not the methodology, not the process. If you're talking about it through the impact, you will much easier be able to back out the simplicity and the easy language. When I do this really complex thing in my job, if I follow that path to the impact on the end person, what is that impact? Now, work backward and describe those steps simply. Okay, that's going to help you. The other thing I want you to do, if you are a very technical, complex, you're in a very complex industry, as I am with communication, is lead with the problem, not the solution. So I could go in there and say, my solution is we're going to put you into a cadence for advisory that's going to give you guardrails to know how to communicate. And we're going to give you accountability that looks and feels like this. And we're going to build you from the ground up, what I call a communications infrastructure, which is just the way that that process piece functions in your business. We're going to build you the infrastructure so that you have a process to communicate effectively. That's my solution. Sometimes it includes putting a branded podcast in there because it serves a certain purpose. And then within that, here's the solution and how the podcast works. But if you lead with that, people are going to just be like, what? What does that even mean? How do I know I even need that? So instead, I lead with the problem. Here's a problem you're having. Your CEO wants to handle all the decision making and is a bottleneck in the comms. And you have high turnover with your marketing coordinator as a result because they're just like, see ya, this sucks, not doing this. Or you have a really awesome product that is just not gaining traction in the market and you don't know why. You know, those are just 2 examples of problems. The other distinction I think you can make, and this is one that I have had to work through myself as well, talking about complex things and making it accessible without dumbing it down, is to instead of think of simplifying things as rather being more specific. Think about this too when you're writing sales pages or sales content. You're having conversations with people about what you do. The more specific you can be in your examples or your anecdotes, the more likely that person is to understand what you're saying. Specificity is different than simplicity. Try swapping those 2 things next time you sit down to write any piece of communications. Specificity helps you unpack complexity. So there's a lot more that I can talk about here. I mean, we could just go on and on and on about how to unpack complex issues and make them accessible. But I wanted to kind of call your attention to this today so that you can think it through as to whether you are unintentionally dumbing down what you do in order to continuously explain yourself, or if you're being overly technical and perhaps alienating some of your audience. Because if your content isn't working, if your sophisticated work is not translated into sophisticated buyers, then the problem isn't actually your work. It's the way you're talking about your work. You need someone who understands complexity and understands story. It's super rare. So I'm not sure what we're going to talk about tomorrow. I am actually looking for some feedback on the show. So if you're catching this on YouTube, please drop me a note in the description below. I would love to see it. If you're catching this on the podcast, you can hit me up on LinkedIn in the DMs, send a connection request. Awesome. Or you can find me on Instagram, send me a DM over there. I would love to know what you want to see me talk about for the remaining week and a bit of this series. Because there's a lot of other things that we can go through. We can talk about sales. We can talk more about comms theory. We can talk about communications infrastructure. We can talk about creating a practice like this, finding your rhythm. But I want to hear from you. And don't forget to rate the show, send it to your friends. All of this goes a huge, long way to helping us grow. So that was my specific, simple way to explain the complex task of growing a podcast and a YouTube channel. Thanks so much for watching, listening, being here. I'll be back tomorrow.